While the two biggest economies in the G20 bloc, the US and the EU, differ over which goes first and how to implement the measures. The US wants economic stimulus measures, the EU proposes strengthening financial surveillance and reforming the international financial system. So back in our studio, Professor, what do you make of the differences between the US stance and the EU stance on which comes first?
Well, I guess the U.S. want economic stimulus simply because the U.S. government think this time is not enough for U.S. to act alone. So they need coordination from the EU. But, you know, there are many countries in the EU. And I guess the most important thing is the financial surveillance from the EU side, which represent different ideologies from the U.S. side, simply because the U.S. government has been encouraging Wall Street to take risks, namely to invent a lot of financial product derivatives, which might be creating more risks, and from perspective of EU, that's a downside. So this time EU wants more financial surveillance, while the US side, they don't want to say too much restrictions on the Wall Street behavior. I think that's going to make a big difference on the future development of our financial system as well as the products.
But why the EU countries are not so willing to accept more stimulus packages in their own countries? Is there any political pressure from the domestic side?
Oh, definitely, especially for European countries. Each country, if you look at their budget, the fiscal budget, a lot of them are in debt. So if you all agree on the stimulus package, where the money is going to come from, I guess the U.S. government has to understand that there are a lot of European countries. Each countries are different.
So what is your understanding of the conflict between the US and EU on a global financial surveillance framework? Is that a possible idea?
We have been talking about a global financial surveillance system for a period of time. For instance, Bank of International Settlement represents some progress, but remember that these are incremental changes. And if you know the financial surveillance words, that represents a lot of small things. For instance, accounting principles, whether it should be marked to the market or historical values, and all these are very complicated. Hedge funds is another issue. So I will not be expecting a big change, a big step from this summit in, let's say, a big announcement on the unified financial surveillance standard. That's impossible.
And also, different countries have different legal systems and the practices.
Yes.
How can they coordinate and cooperate on the supervision front?
That's very difficult. That's why I mentioned when we have BIS, Bank of International Settlement, they set up standard for different banks to operate. They set up every qualifications for capitals, and that's already a big achievement. But for other things, hedge funds, private equities, and all these international financial flows, it's very hard to regulate.
And on the other side, the U.S. is still burdened by the what they call a toxic asset of the financial institutions. Do you think there will be a time when all these messes will be cleared from the financial institutions, both in U.S. and in Europe?
I guess the U.S. government can learn from Chinese government. We are dealing with toxic assets for our four big banks. Of course, the important thing is that once you get rid of the toxic assets, if the economy can go back on its own track for a long period of time, and that toxic assets will not be so toxic as it started. So I guess the real thing is how we operate after you're dealing with the toxic assets. If the economy can be really, say, performing at a 3%, 4% growth rate as in U.S. has been doing, I guess all those toxic assets will be sort of evaporated after years.
From the national level, for example, the U.S., do you think the policies provided by Timothy Geithner of combining private sector in investing in buying the toxic assets will be a feasible way to get it insolvent in some way?
It is a feasible, but it's also a kind of risky, I think, because it involves leverage. I think the leverage this time is pretty huge. I give you an example. $100 assets now is like $84, and the private individuals, I think, can get $6 to acquire all that $84 assets, of course, with $78 guarantee loans from the government. Now, what if the assets value drop below $78 and
So still a risky bet.
very risky leverage?
Okay, you're watching a special coverage on the G20 summit in London. We'll be continuing our report in a while. Don't go away.